Well, a good day to you all. I know it's hard to believe, but what you're looking at here is a genuine DRZ400S. This is what you might want to call a project bike. I picked this bike up off a very nice gentleman named Justin. He had the bike for a while. The story is he had it rebuilt recently, and it looks recent. In fact, the box for the cylinder is in with all the parts. Wiseco piston. He rode it for a couple hundred miles and said it started smoking. Sent the head off to have it redone on the rebuild. He doesn't believe that they even took it apart and replaced any of the valve seals. Also, he might have been concerned that the ring gaps were not properly aligned, and that might be part of the problem. So, but other than that, the bike was running when he took it back apart, and it had just been sitting for a couple of years. So now it's my turn. Let's see what we can do with this thing. Cylinder works cylinder. Still has all the cross hatching in it. Wiseco piston. Right away I see the oil control ring gaps are lined up. That's never going to work. Bottom end feels real good. Crankshaft's tight. Bunch of gaskets. Seals, gaskets, oil filter, some top end stuff. Obviously it's missing the head gasket. Have to order a new gasket set. Water pump rebuild kit. Spark plug. Carburetor. Certainly going to need to be gone through. Cylinder head. Looks like it's in decent condition, just needs to be cleaned up. Box from the piston kit. See if the old piston was in here. Stock piston. And the thing actually looks really good, although the rings are certainly collapsed. The piston itself's in really nice shape. Some air filters. Original cylinder, which really does not look like it's in bad shape either. Obviously I'd have to measure it, but it may be one to just go off to the side. Guess it's a feeler gauge set that came apart. It's going to take me a little while to go through all this stuff. There's a ton of parts, and I'm not even 100% sure they all go to this bike. Now I know this doesn't go to it. So you got a couple of tubes. Well, this is a bonus right here. Flywheel puller, crank separator, crankcase separator tool, all brand new in the box. And we got the exhaust. I'm not sure what brand it is. Carbon fiber. Big old diesel tip. And there are other boxes full of fuel tank, plastics, other miscellaneous parts. Whew. It's going to be a lot on this thing to put together and decipher. But at this time, we'll just start getting everything laid out to get this top end and this bottom end back together. One thing I did not see is the clutch assembly. but there are a few more boxes. Oil pump, dowels. Here's the shift mechanism, starter and drive gears, stator, timing chain, tensioner, more miscellaneous bolts and nuts. Well, here's your clutch basket and all that stuff. Cardboard diagrams with all the bolt holes and where they go. Carburetor parts. Here's our head gasket and all that stuff. I'm going to go ahead and get some new stuff. I guess here's your piston rings. Again, we'll just replace them. This one here is going to be a project. Well, it took a little bit of time to dig through all the parts and go over and decipher all of this stuff. I'm not 100% sure why he was taking everything apart on this, but literally everything was taken apart on this. So I got the bottom end put pretty much back together. I'm just going to throw the clutch in it, and then we can start working on the top end. One thing to take note is on your crankshaft gear, where it meshes into your counterbalance shaft, there are 2 notches. Make sure that those are lined up properly. Now for your spacer and your judder spring, you want to make sure that it concaves in towards the hub. This picture does a pretty good job of explaining how that spring goes. And the last clutch plate will go in line with the rest of them. Now some manufacturers, including Yamaha and Honda, sometimes want you to clock the disc off one from the rest of the pack. And the reason they do that is because it takes some of the stress off of the basket and the pack as the clutch is engaging. Suzuki doesn't specifically recommend that you do that. And to be quite honest with you, even if it does recommend that you do that and you put them all straight, you're not going to damage your clutch or hurt anything. I got a lot of flack in my Shadow 750 clutch install that I had not clocked one disc off, and I've got a ton of miles on this thing with even with the cheap clutch, and it still works beautifully, so no issues. So if you're supposed to clock it off and you don't panic. Don't lose any sleep over it. Tighten your clutch bolts in a cross pattern incrementally until it's tight. This will help to alleviate the possibility of warping anything. We got our piston all cleaned up. Got a new set of rings for it. Wisco comes with its instructions, and one thing we're going to do is check the end gaps in our cylinder, which all the information will be on the paperwork that they give you. And then once the proper ring gap is set, then we're going to go ahead and get our rings installed on the piston in the correct orientation. Now the oil control rails are not super important. We'll just measure them real quick, make sure that they have at least 0.010 of an inch of clearance. Is what they recommend. If it's more, not a big deal. Now the first and second rings on this particular model only go in one spot, so just as a tip, when we're putting these on the piston, the mark should always face up. Sometimes it'll just have a punch mark. This one says N100. Put that in the cylinder. We'll use our piston to square it up. and we'll take a measurement on our end gap to make sure that's within spec. Our cylinder measures at 89.9 millimeters. We'll just call it 90 millimeters for ease of mathematics. And if we go by the chart that Weisco supplied, second ring is 0.45 millimeter minimum end gap. Top ring will be 0.36 millimeter minimum end gap. So we'll take our 0.45, get a measurement. That fits perfectly. Does not require any mods. Next one, 0.36. I don't have a 0.36, so I have 0.35 millimeter, and that fits fine. Then the oil control ring gaps are minimum 0.10 inch. I know I'm bouncing back and forth between inch and millimeter, but it's a quarter of a millimeter, 0.25. So as long as it's larger than that, we're good to go. Now I'm going to install my rings on my piston right now. You can do this now, or you can do it once you put the piston on the connecting rod. And it really depends on what I'm doing with the engine. Sometimes this is easier just to do this and then slide the piston into the cylinder while you have it here on the bench. Getting the rings and the piston inside the cylinder is sometimes a little bit easier if you're not fighting with the connecting rod. Now when setting these rings up, obviously you want to make sure your piston is going to be facing in the right direction. This diagram shows front of engine. Generally, there will be an arrow of some sort on the piston pointing towards the exhaust side. That's not always the case. Sometimes it points at the intake side. But you can also look at your valve reliefs on the piston. These two valve reliefs are much larger, so they're going to go towards the back of the engine or the intake side. So probably very difficult to see, but our bottom oil rail gap is right here, and our top oil rail gap is over here. And then of course the two butted ends sort of blend in once you get it together, but that's right here. Second compression ring gap towards the front on this model. And last but not least, top compression ring towards the back. This way all of our gaps are staggered. Next step, we'll get our orientation together. If you have to put a mark on it, front. And also mark this side if you have to, just so you know. I'm going to use a little 2-cycle oil in the cylinder. Make sure all this slides down easily. It's just a thinner viscosity oil. I like to use it putting these together, but you can certainly just use the engine oil. Now if you look, there's a little bit of a chamfer on the cylinder, and that will help for the rings to get pushed in. Next, we're just going to follow our forward mark, put that with the forward on our cylinder, and this is where it gets tricky. Now when it comes time to get the oil control rings, and you got to really be careful because they will fold up and bend, especially where the end gaps are. Be very, very cautious when sliding these in. And that's basically it. You got your piston started. You can actually pull it back up just enough so that you can get your piston pin in. And we're ready to install this cylinder on our engine. Go ahead and throw a zip tie around your cam chain loosely. It'll make it a lot easier for you to manipulate it. Put some rags over your crankcase when you go to install your circlip. If it falls, at least it won't go down inside the crankcase. little tough to fish out. Now I'm going to go ahead and take the cylinder head apart, clean everything up real good, valves, replace the valve seals, and get the valves shimmed properly to get ready to be reinstalled. Now obviously if you watch some of my other videos, you've seen me do this. I'm not going to draw it out in this one. I'm going to go ahead and do it off camera, but the principle is the same. Well, as it turns out, after taking this head apart, somebody has been in here. Don't know exactly what they did, but one of these little collars, a spacer on the bottom of the spring, is actually missing. So that's really important because this is an aluminum head and it definitely will start digging in after a while, but luckily doesn't seem like this was run for very long. I got my new spring seat, got all the valves reinstalled, get everything shimmed up properly. Now we can just bolt this head on and continue this build. For those that are curious, there's your valve specs for these DRZ400s. I believe it's the same for the E, the S, the SM. They're probably all going to be the same from 2000 to present. For our main head bolts, a little bit of oil on the threads and on the washers. Next we'll torque our head bolts in stages. Start here, come across, back into here, and what they want is 18 foot-pounds initially, and then we go back over them with 33.5 foot-pounds. I don't have any way to get 33.5 foot-pounds, so 33 or 34 is going to have to be good enough. Just bring them down until I start feeling a little bit of tension, and we'll start torquing them. That's as close as I'm going to get to 33.5. Okay. This zip tie trick works pretty good. Suzuki uses a bolt that goes through here that keeps it from falling down, which is actually a pretty smart idea. So I'll go ahead and remove my custom tool. Well, now before we can get our cams installed, we have to get this thing back on top dead center. How do we do that without any timing marks? Well, there's actually a pretty simple procedure for this. Either a long screwdriver or a straw or something sticking down inside the spark plug hole will tell you when you're at top dead center. Now as I rotate the crankshaft, when the piston starts coming up, it's going to hit the screwdriver, it will push it up, and vice versa. So what we're trying to do is get the screwdriver at its topmost travel. Okay, so honestly you're going to feel a little bit of drag as you're rotating the engine going up and down. When you get to the top, it actually feels like super loose. There's like a very, very like loose spot. Almost you can just barely move it with your fingers, okay? And that's going to be right at your top dead center. And this will work with most bikes. And it's going to get you pretty damn close. You can always go back once you get your timing cover on and recheck your timing marks. But almost guaranteed that this is going to get you where you need to be. Now this particular engine, some Yamahas do it too. On your flywheel, there's actually going to be a mark, T, with a line, and then there's a mark on your case as well. And when those marks line up, you know you're on top dead center. Now we can go ahead and set our camshafts in. I'm going to start with the exhaust side. This side we want to make sure we have tension on the front of the chain. Timing marks are as follows. 1 points forward and will line up with the head. 3 points backwards, also line up with the head. And the 2 is going to point straight up at the sky. Now we certainly don't want to rotate the engine in any way, shape, or form, but we'll double check it as we go. Next we'll install our intake camshaft. Now this is going to be a little different. They want 3 pointing at the sky, 2 will point across the head, 1 obviously will point down. Next we'll obviously double check to make sure we're still on top dead center. Keep in mind that this chain is going to have some slop in it. You want this side to have the tension on it rather than this side, so just rotate the cam that way. Again, make sure that you're still on top dead center. Our arrows are fairly close to the head the way they're supposed to be. Now we're going to count some pins. What we're going to be looking for is 15 pins between the arrow for 2 and the arrow for 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15. If you're on top dead center, these arrows are lined up and you got 15 pins, you're in time as you should be. It's almost foolproof. Now go ahead and just put the cam caps back on, get them torqued down. And our top end is pretty much done. A couple of button up things here and there. Next we'll reinstall our cam chain tensioner. We accomplish this by putting a screwdriver in the back of the cam chain tensioner. As you tighten it, it pulls it in. Now some of these, when you tighten them all the way, they will lock in place. This one does not. And what I like to do is save these little T's that come with new tensioners, and you can lock these back up to make it simple to put it back together. And that will hold it in. Well, pay attention when you take these apart, and if you didn't take it apart like I didn't, sometimes they'll have a marking to let you know which way is up. This one does not have a marking. It does have a 3 on it, so I'm going to put the 3 facing up. But as it turns out, I have to find the bolts for it. Now it's a good idea to go ahead and run this engine a couple of revolutions and then recheck our timing marks. Now from this point on, we're only going to spin this thing counterclockwise from the left hand side. We don't want to ever turn this backwards once the cam chain is installed. And the reason for that is because if it does push against the tensioner and you're going backwards, it could actually jump time. It's going to be a strong running motor. We'll get this thing back on top dead center, but keep in mind, now that the cams are hooked up, you have 2 top dead centers. Technically you only have 1 top dead center, because top dead center just basically means that the piston is at the top of its stroke. However, the cam timing could be off 180 degrees depending on which cycle you're on. So let's just find a top dead center and see where we're at. Marks line back up, and our camshaft timing is lined up perfectly. Looks like we might have done something right on this one. I'm going to go ahead and reinstall my thermostat. Now if you're unsure of whether this is good or not, easy way to test them is to throw a pot of water on the stove and throw a thermometer in it and throw this in and bring it up, and obviously it should open up where it's recommended. And honestly, I don't know on these. Sometimes they're marked. I don't know on this one what it's supposed to open up at, but if you get this thing up to where it's boiling and it has not opened, then obviously you got a stuck thermostat. If you look down inside that little metal plate, as this thing heats up, this metal plate will push against the spring and it allows water through. Little trick to holding O-rings in: put a little bit of dielectric grease on them, I prefer it over like wheel bearing grease. I've been enjoying far too much mobility lately. Now that I got this engine built, it's time to lay myself out on the couch for a week by throwing my back out. Let's put this motor in this frame. Well, after the better part of 6 years putting this thing together, at least that's what it felt like, she's a fighter. A couple things we definitely learned about this bike. One, I won't work on these anymore. I shouldn't say that. This particular one has got some weird kind of things, but I did learn a lot. The guy I bought it off of lost the key, so I ended up getting a lock set for it. One of those cheapo depot lock sets, 35 bucks I think, out the door. And came with everything and actually works pretty good. However, the fuel cap did not fit. What I found on these, which might help you out, if you've got the chrome gas cap, that's a California model. If you got the black twisty turny, this is the federal or the rest of the world kind of deal. So the kit I bought came with this. So since I don't have a key for this one, and the mechanism was taken apart on this so that they could get into the gas cap, there's pieces missing. So I bought another cheapo depot and I'm going to see if I can make that work. There's one issue. They put a lot of electronics on this thing, so figuring out all that wiring and getting rid of what wasn't needed was a little bit of a chore as well. Thirdly, someone did the 3x3 mod, and what that is basically where the snorkel goes in to the air box. You basically rip that out of there and cut a 3x3 inch square. Helps let more air into the air box itself. Somebody did the FCR carb update on it. Now this came from a KTM, and trying to figure all this stuff out was a little bit of a pain. But I've got it together. Still waiting on a few parts here and there, a clutch cable and a few other things. But I'm going to go ahead and throw some fuel in this thing. I'm going to put the new battery in, see if it catches on fire. If not, we're going to twirl on this thing, and fingers crossed. But I'm not really optimistic about this one because I have no idea whether or not the electronics are good on it. I know the motor is solid at this point, but maybe more diagnostics in the future. But let's just give it a shot. No sparks, no burning smell. So far so good. Put a little bit of non-ethanol in there. Like I said, I'm gonna have to take this back apart again. That's all I got is a little bit. When I talked to the seller again to find out why he was taking most of the engine apart, he basically just said he wanted to refresh the thing, but he updated me on it. He said he made a mistake. It wasn't burning oil, but it was running rich. It was blowing black smoke. So when I pulled this carburetor apart, the main jet was broken right off. So there was no main jet. It was just the thread sticking in there. So it probably had something to do with it. Oh, let me grab the key. Nothing. It was just on. What do I got here? Bad connection. As it turns out, when you buy a $35 lock set, you get a $35 lock set. But nothing a zip tie can't fix. I've learned that from working on all these bikes. Alright, let's give this another gopher. It cranks. Yeah, let's try with the choke on. Idle's definitely going to need to come up. I screwed it all the way out because I didn't really know where it needed to be. So, wow, pretty impressed that that thing started up. A quick little run. Let me go ahead and just recheck the oil and check the coolant and tune this carb just a little bit and be right back. It sounds pretty good. I'm going to run a few heat cycles on it, see if we can burn some of this assembly oil out of here. And hopefully we can get the clutch cable here and a couple other things and take this thing out for a ride.